Hello, everyone. Welcome to the HR.com event today. I'm so excited to be here and have you all here with me. Just by introduction, my name is Rob Catalano. I'm one of the founders of WorkTango. We've spent, over a decade helping companies listen to their employees, recognize great work. My goal is to bring 21 years of my experience in building great workplaces into our conversation today for our topic, improving employee experience with a modern survey strategy 2026 and beyond. When we actually founded WorkTango, we said we don't want a mission statement because missions end. We wanted a passion statement. And you can see it on my shirt. It's to improve work lives. And work is in parentheses because, for better or worse, we spend most of our waking time at work. And if we can improve that, that just improves people's lives in general. So I'm lucky I get to go to work every day trying to build great employee experiences and really passionate about it. And it's really what today's topic is about, right? How do we leverage one strategy when it comes to employee listening, employee voice, in order to build that great experience we all want in our world, we all want to provide our employees. Now, beyond just being a passionate individual in this world, I'm also really passionate about music. I actually was a failed musician, so that career didn't work out. But I love what I do today, and I've been doing for the last 2 decades. So you're going to notice a lot of discussion today around music. I like infusing it in my presentations. And actually, what I want to start before diving into the topic today and exactly what we're going to talk about is I actually want to start with a bit of a story. And that story starts with these four individuals. Now, you probably recognize them, right? And they have something in common beyond being famous musicians. Now, I know what you're thinking. Yes, Steven Tyler looks like John Travolta in Grease. When I first saw it, I couldn't get out of my mind. I still can't. But again, there's something in common is that they are famous musicians, but they aren't just famous singers. They actually hold the record in the recording studio for the widest vocal range at around 6 octaves. And if you know anything about music, that's super, super impressive. Now, you know who these people are, right? They're famous people, right? I'm pretty sure every single one of this people that's in the room knows all four of these individuals. But I bet you don't know this man. And this is actually Tim Storms. He holds the Guinness record for the widest vocal range at 10 octaves. He crushes them all. And I know what you're thinking, Rob, what does this have to do with employee listening and employee voice and listen and building a better experience? And a few things I want to call out and why I tell this story. First off, there's a range of voices in organizations that we just don't hear from, right? We typically hear the loudest person in the room, right? But we forget there's employees under the radar that have a wider range of opinions, right? Beyond just the popular opinions or the opinions that have louder voices, right? There's people like Tim that we're not even aware of in organizations and don't have that voice. And the second reason I tell this story is that I'm guilty of listening to the same music for a long time. And that's okay for music, right? Right? Listening to the same music is great, but you can't be doing the same things you used to do and doing the same things all the time when it comes to your HR practices and your listening practices, right? We're so stuck in what we know, we don't change our approach. Now, taking a quick sidebar here, when it comes to music, I'm still listening to the same CNC Music Factory and Metallica albums today, right? Probably almost 30 years now. And if you're not familiar with what's on the screen, these are cassettes, right? This is what I grew up with, but I'm hip to the game. I download music now. I listen on my phone, all that fun stuff. But in the spirit of listening to the same music all the time, a lot of organizations are still doing the same things and are guilty when it comes to listening to their employees and using the annual engagement survey as sometimes the only way, and in many times the predominant way to understand employee sentiment, right? To listen to employees to improve that employee experience that we all want. The problem is it's too infrequent, it's too isolated, right? And it's only one single part of that employee experience. But what's crazy is that this is the same method of hearing the voice of employees that was created over 100 years ago. I am not joking. It was invented over 100 years ago during the war. And think about it, organizations today are still using it as the predominant way to understand employee sentiment, right? We have to change our approach. Our workplace is different. Our people are different. The generations are different. Excuse me. And the point of this story is that problems are durable and solutions change, right? Think about everything changing around us in HR, right? We'll be hard pressed to recruit, retain, and inspire employees and engage them, right? And build a great experience. But those problems will always be there. We just have to change in the way that we're solving those problems, right? We have to change the solutions, and doing the same things that we used to do for decades isn't going to work today, especially if you want a better employee experience. So I tell this story to kind of lead into what we're going to talk about today. First, why employee voice is critical, right? We'll get into some of the non-believers, right? Why is it critical in your organization? Why should we even think about it? Second, I want to talk a bit about the evolution, right? How have companies shifted from perhaps that annual world to a couple of other stages in that journey? And again, you might be in different stages within that, but I think you'll find value to understand what the journey might be for you if you're thinking of changing that approach. Third, what I want to spend most of the time today are really four pillars or four trends that I'm seeing when companies are shifting their employee survey and listing strategy. That's where they're seeing impact. So I want to talk about those. I want to share real approaches, real stories. And lastly, I want to share four mindsets to leave you with. I was really lucky, right? I've been doing this for so long that when I speak to companies and HR leaders that have gone through the journey I'm going to share today, I asked a lot of them, what was the right mindset you had that got you to success? And I basically collaborated to kind of put all that information together to share with you some of those mindsets as well. So, really, my goal today, right, is taking what I call a wisdom of crowds approach, right? I have been so blessed to work with organizations, large, medium, small, local, globally around the world. And I want to take all those wisdom of crowds to sharing with our, 55 minutes that we have today. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Um, So what you might be thinking right now, what you might be asking, and I actually ask myself every time I'm going to share, a conversation in this type of forum, I always want to ask the question, who cares? Right? Why should you care about this? And I love this picture because nothing depicts who cares better than this image. I always joke now that, AI is impressive, but nothing impresses me more than asking Google, like, give me a picture about who cares, and this is what shows up first, right? That algorithm is gold. Um, I could spend all day on this, but I really just want to highlight a few data points, things of why you should care. Like I said, maybe you're a non-believer, but why should you care about the topic we're talking about today? The first reason why you should care, and maybe you can use this to get other people in your organization to care. And what I'm showing are just a few items. There's so many more, so feel free to reach out if you'd like. But a couple of reasons why we should care. This is just some validation from the market, right? Many of us know Josh Bersin and his organization, but organizations that actively listen to employees and act are 12 times more likely to engage and retain employees. We all want more engagement. We all want more retention, right? This is what's important to us. So there's a lot of data out there that's available to you. But the other thing I wanted to share, which I thought was really interesting, right? The HR.com research report that actually was created in conjunction with this event, right, talks about the future of human experience in 2025, right? It's all about employee feedback, right? How do we use feedback to craft enhanced experiences, which is very, very specific to what we're talking about today. And what I found interesting is when the question asked, of the technologies listed, which five are most useful for improving the employee experience in your organization? Number one is employee recognition. Number two is employee survey, feedback, and communication. Amazing, right? So I'm not going to talk about recognition today. Many companies have done that today, even though WorkTango provides that offering, and I've seen it change organizations. I've seen a lot of value in it. I think it's great. I'm going to shift the conversation to the second one, employee survey, feedback, and communication tools, right? And this is great. Like, this is what's helping companies improve the employee experience. So a lot of data there, even as recent as February this year. Last reason why you should care. I don't know if any people have seen this before, but it's called the surface profit chain. And what it does identifies the idea that if employees are doing great things and are happy, then customers will be happy and be doing great things, and that'll turn into shareholder value, or however you define the success of your organization, right? Maybe it's profitability, maybe it's, the happiness of your community, those types of things. But what's interesting about this equation is that customer satisfaction and shareholder value are outputs. What I mean is you can't change that unless you change the inputs, right? And the real inputs to this equation are your employees, right? What they do every day, the products they build, the services they offer, the interaction and collaboration in the organization, right? There's a lot of evidence that I already shared here, but if you take it to brass tacks, if we don't build a greater experience, if we don't understand the sentiment of what's working and what isn't to navigate our way to success, we're never going to get to the outputs of customer satisfaction and growth of your company. So why you should care is because this is where it all starts, right? Listening to your employees and understanding their experience and removing those barriers right? That's really where the magic happens. And we can't build it without listening to the voice of our employees. So that being said, let's get into the major chunk of the conversation today, right? 4 employee survey trends towards building a great employee experience. Think of them as 4 pillars to think about your strategy as you go into 2026, right? If I were going to change and shift my approach next year, what can I start thinking about in terms of what those pillars are to make sure I have the right goals in place? So we'll go through those 4, and at the end, we'll get into the mindsets. First thing I want to share, though, in terms of the number one pillar or trend, is it's all about what I call continuous listening. Now, I might be cheating here. This isn't really a music reference. I guess it's more of a movie reference with Marty McFly here and Back to the Future. But I think, when you think about this idea of Back to the Future, let's not think of the past, but let's think about the future, right? Take away all the constructs of what you do today, right? And think about what's possible. And I'm going to talk to you a bit about that journey. But this whole idea about continuous listening, it's about being agile, just like you see how agile, Marty McFly here is on the guitar. But what I mean by agile is this concept of HR agility means moving quickly, being responsive, being nimble, right? And effectively managing change, right? And guess what? A lot of change is happening in our organizations over the last 2, 3, 4 years, right? There seems to be a new thing that's happening that's changing the structure of how we do things. Recently, it's AI and enablement from that end in our organizations, right? How technology is being leveraged and so on. But the reason why this is so important, this concept of continuous listening and agility, is because guess what? Success isn't linear, right? Everyone thinks when we create our 2026 goals, or think about we're in 2025 now, right? We're creating our goals. We create these levels and definitions of success, and we know that it's not a straight line, right? It's really that level of navigating through all the change and unknowns and what's happening around us. So think about that, right? Because success isn't linear, it's so important to understand employee sentiment, right? How do we understand and learn what's working, what isn't, and navigate and use that feedback to drive better employee experiences and better company experiences? And I don't know why, from an HR lens, we're so used to looking at the world in annual practices, right? I don't know because we grew up in the finance world and reported to CFOs, but the annual engagement survey, the annual performance review, let's reward people for 5 years because they were breathing for 5 years and recognize their years of service, right? But the reality is employees don't work in years. They work more frequent than that, right? Days, weeks, months, quarters, you name it. So successful organizations have really revolutionized their approach, right? And this has been going on for a while, right? Companies have been moving away from that annual engagement survey. And I've worked with organizations that have done that, but a lot of companies are still doing it, like I mentioned, right? They're still using this as the only way to really get feedback. And I'm talking about it from a work lens. But let me talk about a real life example. I don't know how many of you folks have children that play sports, right? I don't have any children, but I have nieces that play sports. When I think about when they were really young and learning the game, they would go on the field, right? Some kids would be running around and doing great things. Some would be spinning in circles, right? Things that happen on the field. But imagine your children or your nieces or these individuals, these kids, getting feedback at the end of the season, right? They're never going to get better and improve and become more successful in their venture as a better soccer player or a better sports player, right? It's not just feedback at the end of each game, right? It's a feedback that happens throughout the game, right? Each shift, each period, each goal, right? Each inning, you name it. Professional sport teams have coaches that are giving feedback on a frequent basis. But many of our organizations say, all right, this is engagement survey season. We are going to do this once a year and expect to be able to build that experience. But the reality is it's too far away for anyone to be accountable to act, right? And you don't know if what's working or what isn't because your trends are so far apart. So a lot of organizations have taken this idea, and we usually start here and said, we need to do something different. And I've helped companies make this journey hundreds of times and happy to dig deeper and reach out to me. I love to have these conversations. But most companies over the last decade have shifted to what's called pulse surveys. And many of you are familiar, many of you are probably doing the same thing. But the feedback I've been getting from the market or organizations is what most companies do is they say, well, let's take that annual survey and then let's make it a pulse, which is just do it more frequently, right? So we'll make it a little shorter and we'll do it every quarter or twice a year or 3 times a year. The problem with pulses, however, is people get complacent. They tune out. It's the same questions, right? We're just duplicating what we've done. And the reality is it doesn't really work, right? That set it and forget it of listening to your employees, that should never be a set and forget a task. It should be an intentional idea of understanding employee sentiment, learning from that, and then using that information to build a better experience and act on. So the trend where this major theme and this major pillar is all about is more about continuous listening, or what I also call active listening, right? And active listening I'll dive into right now is it's a couple of major things. One, it's more than engagement measurement, right? If you're just measuring engagement once a year, if you're just measuring engagement in general, even more frequently, that is not good enough when it comes to listening to your employee sentiment or your survey strategy or listening to employee voice, right? So even if you get more frequent, right, you're doing more frequent pulses and you're just measuring, it needs to be more about measurement and what I call diagnostic feedback, right? How do you understand what's working, what isn't? How do you get real feedback from employees versus not only just how they feel rating something 1 to 5, but how do they feel about experiences specifically, right? What's working? Why is it working? And really dive in. So this concept of agility is not just frequency in measurement and frequency of listening to employees, but when you combine it with diagnostic feedback, that's when you start hitting success. That's when rubber hits the road. And I've seen companies elevate a lot of their metrics on retention and engagement and so on. Now, Rob, what do you mean more than engagement? And I'll bring it to brass tacks. Here's an example of what I've seen most organizations do when it comes to find success is they will create an active listening model, which is more frequent, right? Again, maybe it's quarterly, maybe it's monthly, right? Whatever works for your organization. And the first thing is you still measure, right? You have an idea more frequently than annually. What's the trends in whatever you're measuring? Maybe you're measuring engagement. Maybe you're measuring DE&I sentiment. Whatever you're measuring, now you can understand quarterly or monthly, not a year later, right? Again, no one's going to do anything different if you're not checking in a year later, right? You can still have that measurement and rotate through trends of seeing what's working or what isn't for the things that drive engagement, for example, like leadership and career growth and those items, right? But the magic in active listening is this diagnostic feedback questioning. For example, you don't need 5 questions on your giant employee engagement survey to know if people feel recognized at work. You need one. And if that sentiment's low on the very small engagement survey, and again, when I say small engagement survey, like stop it with the 80 and 90, 100 questions, right? I recommend 22. But you need one question to know if people feel recognized at work. And if that's low, let's dig deeper into that, into the next active listening pulse. Let's also clarify feedback. Hey, we heard this from the organization, but we're not too sure what's working, what isn't specifically. Let's get some feedback on that. Understanding sentiment on change. Hey, for example, we heard you that recognition sentiment was really low. We acted on it last quarter. What do people think? Is it hitting the mark? Is it not? But also, even better is getting feedback in advance. Hey, we are about to launch something based on the sentiment you provided us. Do people think this works? Are there concerns? Are there thoughts? You're basically getting feedback and testing it in market. Think about bringing agile technology to market, right? You're getting feedback before you give it to the world, right? You're getting feedback to build better HR programs or better people programs or better experience programs. And I always say employee voice is important. You need the open-ended whys and whats. But this idea is that you're effectively taking active listening to measurement to these diagnostic components. And using an exact example, I've had a lot of organizations do this baseline survey, right? 20 questions, 22 questions. And what they'll do is, again, they'll continue measurement. They'll keep baseline questions. The purple is the specific things and intentional questions we ask. And in many companies in green, we can ask questions that just specifically matter to certain departments or locations or types of employees. As you see, you're making this very relevant, and you're making it very specific. And it takes a little more effort, but the impact is insurmountable in some of the metrics I've seen. Now, every time I talk about this, people say, oh, another survey. What about survey fatigue? No one wants to fill out a survey. I'm telling you, there's no such thing as survey fatigue. There's lack of action fatigue. I work with organizations that don't only use active listening on a quarterly basis. I've seen it monthly. I've seen it every 2 weeks. I've seen it every week. And sometimes it's only 3 to 5 questions to start understanding sentiment and deal with smoke before fire. Because if you check in again, right, a year later, there's not a lot you can do to react to that type of feedback. And don't take my word for it. I'm sharing what, again, that wisdom of crowds and what I've seen a lot of companies do. I did a webinar recently with an organization called Rexall. They're a complicated, like 10,000 plus person organization in retail where people aren't sitting in front of computers every day, right? And they have a very specific continuous understanding strategy, which they call it, which talks about four different pulses, right? They still do their EOS or employee opinion survey, right? Their large engagement survey in September, but they still do onboarding survey. They still do exit, ad hoc service based on the needs of the business, right? So yeah, you might have a cadence quarterly, monthly, but if you need to understand feedback on back to work or new AI policies or how people are absorbing AI in your organization, this understanding needs to be a living, breathing world, not just a moment in time. And again, like I can share this webinar if you'd like, and you can hear the information more specifically, but it works, right? They talked a lot about how participation is still super high. Again, even if the majority of employees aren't in front of computers, engagement scores and ENPS scores, right? Growing through the roof. But I think more importantly is there's a lot of action plans being created, right? Leaders are taking accountability into moving the needle on this, and we'll get into that in a moment. But to recap this first pillar about continuous listening, active listening, this is the equation I was mentioning earlier, visual, right? If you really want to start building better experience and change your employee listening strategy, start with increased frequency, right? Add that to measurement and diagnostic feedback, right? Just like that previous slide of showing measurement, plus the other questions that really matter. And that's when you start getting that listing, and that's where you start seeing move the needle. And if anyone still isn't a believer and you want more data on this, I actually did some research last year with Lighthouse Research Advisory. And we asked the question, how often do employees participate in feedback or engagement surveys? And what's interesting here is when you actually, this green call out, what it talks about is if you are listening on a monthly basis, that's when you have kind of an even look at these systems providing a positive ROI in light green and a neutral ROI in purple. What you'll notice is that basically, if you look at all this information in the chart, the positive ROI is 2 to 4 times higher when you're doing it more frequently than annual, right? This is looking at over 850 organizations, right? When they're actually doing it more frequently, there's 2 to 4 times higher ROI. And that's even just moving it from yearly to every few months, right? And again, once you get to that feedback cadence monthly, that's where you start seeing a much more level of impact. And I get it, right? It's hard to change a strategy. Monthly might seem a little too aggressive, but maybe start with quarterly or something a little more frequent. If you don't believe me, believe Josh, right? You cannot maintain positive employee experience without listening to your people on a continuous basis. I know you're thinking, yeah, this is nothing new, but many HR leaders still struggle to convince their companies and themselves of this concept. They think it's a lot more work, but it's not when you talk about some of the pillars and trends I'm going to talk about now, right? And the reality is if you really want to build a great employee experience, it comes with more intentional effort, right? There's a little more that has to be done than the set it and forget it annual engagement survey. You're never going to get success if you continue that strategy. So, talking about enabling this leads me to my next pillar, next trend, the second one. And it's really around amplifying voice and action with new technology. Let's be honest, right? Technology is making it easier for companies to find more value through employee surveys, right? Value in employee voice. It's value in anything to do from an HR lens, right? Whether we're talking about continuous listening and action or all the pillars of what you're doing, whether that's wellness or DE&I or L&D or you name it, right? Technology will provide a kind of a next level to make things more palpable, right? To better get more agile. And you need it to be able to build that experience for your employees. Here's just a good example, right? I don't know how many people remember this, but when I bought the cassette tape of my favorite band, it came with this long leaf that I opened up and it had all the lyrics. And I would look at that and read that and follow along. But that's a lot of work, right? That was a lot of work to be able to read this. Now, the reason why I'm bringing this up is we all, when it comes to surveys, have to read hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of comments sometimes. Now, these comments are so valuable, right? They give more context to just how are you feeling about work. But again, technology just changes the game, right? And again, some people have been doing this for 5, 7, 8 years. But if you aren't, in one click, organizations get trends and themes of what people are thinking, but also sentiment. Is it negative, neutral, or is it positive, right? Not only can they do that, if we can start digging deeper and looking at actual themes, right? I just want to dive into management or those specific items. So things are getting a lot easier with technology. And even with AI, it's even getting a lot easier, right? Here's a quick analysis of my organization or team of what's going well and what isn't, or some other major themes within themes about what people are saying en masse. So again, right, with an unbiased view, being able to understand what are people saying when you don't have the time to read hundreds of comments, technology is offering that opportunity to not only understand them, but dig a little deeper. Now, when it comes to understanding comments and digging deeper, technology doesn't even allow that. It also allows the ability to interact with actually these comments, right? Think about it, right? There are ways today to interact with comments and still keep confidentiality. You've all been there, right? You've read a survey comment and it's super scary, but it's so vague and you can't do anything about it, right? And that's the worst place to be, right? You really don't know what to do. You can't dig deeper. But technology today is just an example of like the ability to read something and have an actual confidential conversation. Right, here's an example of diving in, and the individual knows whose I am, but I have no idea who the individual is. And there's all these, certain components and ways that you can make sure that it's, communicates as confidential. And there's going to be believers and non-believers, but it truly is. But I'm just giving you examples, right? And we think about all the things that look like they took a lot of time, or even things you never thought were possible, right? Technology can really help you get there. And again, it wouldn't be an HR session if I didn't talk more about AI in 2025. But think about the whole process of this survey and listening process, this the survey and listening strategy, right? There's listening, there's understanding, and then there's acting. And AI is just changing the game here, right? We're identifying bias in questions before we even ask them, auto translated in your work language, dynamic questioning, right? How does AI dig deeper into what people are asking to get a better answer or a better understanding of sentiment or possibly even what we should do differently? From an understanding perspective, again, one click, its ability to summarize insights, not just qualitatively, like I mentioned, but quantitatively. Here are the trends that are happening. Here, how do we bubble this up to the top and actually nudge HR leaders or leaders with that information? Or how do you highlight anomalies and trends? Right? How do you correlate it with other data sets that you have in your organization? And from an act perspective, now we're getting into actions being recommended immediately, delivering curated learning experiences. There's a lot from an enablement perspective, AI is there. So again, the reason why I'm sharing this is we have to think about how are we leveraging new technology to be able to drive things forward. Now, if you're scared of AI, you could do something a little different and start embedding chips in your body like this company. Um, I'm completely kidding. I do not recommend this. I read it recently and thought it was interesting. What I found even more interesting, this is August 17th, 2018. Like people were doing this 7 years ago. I don't know what they're doing today. But I'm joking, but I read this recently and it really bothered me. It said it's an automated world and HR is just living in. We should be driving it, right? Take employee surveys and listening and action out of the equation. Just ask yourself, what is your HR tech strategy? What is your strategy for 2026? What is your strategy for the next 5 years? Are you leveraging technology to improve all the pillars I talked about within your employee experience focus areas, right? Even from a talent acquisition perspective. So again, bring this up because at the end of the day, when it comes to employee listening, you can't refute the impact of technology. And one last stat or data point I'll share is I've had the pleasure of working with so many organizations. And when I started talking to them when they weren't leveraging technology, I asked how long this process took from deciding what the questions to ask are to getting an actual action done from a leader. And it was on average around 4+ months, right? That is a long time. But the moment you embedded technology into it, it was less than 3 weeks. So the ROI and speed and activity costs of doing it manually just speaks for itself, right? So when companies think about, well, I can't do more than an annual survey, well, you can, right? It doesn't take that long to be able to move to action if you're leveraging technology. We talked about continuous listening agility, number one. Number two, right? How do we leverage technology to get there, which you really need? But the third, and I think most strategic shift of all that I think provides the biggest influence is leaders have to be at the center of your survey strategy. They are your secret weapon, right? Not only for this, but probably a lot more. But they need to be the central part of how you make this all work. And I'm sorry, I feel bad for managers. They're the face of these antiquated practices that say, hey, here's some data from an annual survey. We're not going to check in and let you know how you're doing for another year. The data that we just gave you is also 2 months stale because we have to go sit and meet with everyone to provide that information. But the reality is, we're not providing them the enablement that they need to be able to provide success. And think about it, right? You do not succeed from an HR lens unless you have your leaders. You cannot solve all the world's problems, right? Your leaders have to for their individual teams and needs. Ask yourself a very, very, very serious question right now. Are your managers tools? Obviously, I'm joking, right? But, right, are they a good tool that can help drive the success of your company? Or are they just a tool, right? I actually looked up the other tool definition in the dictionary. It said a fool that is characterized by low intelligence and low self-esteem. That's painful, right? But this is the stigma that managers have in organizations, right? I went to Google and said, my manager, and I let this pop up. Interesting results, right? Unfortunately, they're a little more negative. Hates me, incompetent. In French, I'm in Toronto, by the way. Welcome, hello, Canadians. Is ignoring me, anxiety, bullying me, gaslighting me, even, right? Like, and what's funny is at the bottom right there, I read that little report, inappropriate predictions, when Google tries to improve their predictions, but like these are all inappropriate. Like, I can't believe this is what people search for the most in our organization. It paints a pretty concerning picture of the employee manager relationship. So managers clearly have some room to improve, right? But from an HR lens, we have a huge role in that. So in other words, how do we enable them with tools and we don't create tools in our organization? What are you doing to enable leaders when it comes to this employee listening process with technology, with real-time information, with a better process or expectation of just doing things once a year? One of the most rapidly growing trends and what great companies are doing, and my advice to you, right? If you're going to do one thing where I've seen impact when it comes to employee metrics and the ROI of these investments in time and dollars to conduct these survey strategies, is HR, please don't be a filter. Filters are cute for music celebrities, right? But not in the workplace. I see so many companies that will do their survey. I don't care if it's engagement or a pulse or it's an onboard or whatever it is, and they will not share the data with the leaders. Like, some of them say, we'll share you the data, but we won't share the verbatim comments to them. They are supposed to be your leaders, right? They're leading your organization and your people and your team. Back to the idea that HR, you can't solve all the world's problems if we're not giving authentic feedback to our leaders who are supposed to enable, right, to be able to build those experiences for our teams. There's a missing link there, right? You must give employee feedback directly to every single leader in an organization. Yes, there's confidentiality, and platforms can allow you to say, if it's not over 5 responses, don't show the information, or show it in aggregate, or show multiple teams together, but some level of ability to be able to share so leaders understand what they could be working on, right? We'll talk later when it comes to data in terms of approaches, but you can't fix everything. And guess what? A one size fits all solution isn't going to be good for every single team. It's going to be good for some teams and not good for others. And sharing this data with leaders, right? Not only does it build accountability to act and do something, it builds trust with them. So my ask, and I'm sorry, I know it's another bad music analogy, but it's important to really understand who are you pushing data to, right? But also, who has access to pull information from you? Think about it. When you activate the ability to get push data automatically so leaders can log in and see their dashboards of what's working, what isn't, their scores, their trends, you've built this level of accountability, but you've also saved yourself so much time to not have to conduct these manual conversations of meeting with each leader, pulling reports, and doing that across your company. That takes a ton of time. Putting their hands in, immediately and having actions and accountability to take that information and act on it, building that structure, where you're going to see scale, where you're going to see impact on the employee experience. And just from a personal perspective as an HR leader, I don't want to start sharing people data manually or getting requests of what people want. I want to be focused on more strategic ways to build a better experience. So a lot of companies, and it's a big mindset shift to get to, but once they get there, right, it provides so much value. Using that same Rexall example, on that webinar, they shared this exact slide. Why we give leaders access to their team survey results. Look at the box on the left-hand side, the green box. Highlighting survey results and opportunities for every team in the business shouldn't sit with HR and the most senior executive team. It's not giving the employee voice the soundboard it deserves, right? If individual contributor X is so far removed from the executive team, that feedback's not really going to go far. And guess what? People are less, they're not going to provide you this feedback as often, right? There's less willingness to be able to provide that level of support. And if you look on the right, it creates a culture of trust, true visibility. They own analyzing, right? They own communication and addressing results, right? HR is not going to do it for you. And it also enables that action plan to create a nudge, to create positive change, right? Leaders arguably have the biggest influence on the engagement and success of your employees. And I say arguably, I'll argue it all day, right? But how can you give them that nudge? Like just some quick ideas of how, right? There are so many technologies that can actually identify and suggest what they should do when it comes to driving action, right? But you can use all the technology you want, but whether you do or not, here's just one piece of advice: make it digestible. I always like to say actions, make them as easy as one, two, three. Finish your survey, whether you have technology or not, say, you know what, pick one area of opportunity, leader, right? Think about all the factors that drive engagement, right? Pick one, two actions to support that, and make sure that we talk about it 3 times and you're talking about it 3 times with your teams. Pretty simple. But if you build that structure the moment that leaders are getting information from you, they know exactly what to do. Now, it was really interesting, and we talked a bit about technology, and I left this part till the end. But when it comes to leadership enablement, technology and AI is really changing the game. And I'm talking about things like AI leader coaches. So think about a 24/7 coach for every leader, right? Not just saved for executive teams from a coaching perspective, but every leader to be able to nudge them what their teams are saying, right? To nudge them and give recommendations of what their actions should be so they can add them to their action plans, or have role plays of having hard conversations, right? Many technologies are actually allowing you to say it in your policies in your voice, or not recommend things, right? Recommend things if it's similar to the or feedback from the survey, but don't recommend it if it's about certain topics, and make sure you reach out to HR, right? So the reality is we're building scale from a technology and AI lens when it comes to activating and enabling leaders, which I think is really great from an HR lens. And I think the next phase and evolution of what these feedback surveys are going to provide organizations. And a sidebar just beyond surveys on the topic of leadership enablement, if you look at Gartner's top 5 priorities in HR for 2025, leader and manager development's number one. It's been number one, I think, for 3 or 4 years running. So again, this is something that's critical. So whether it's your survey strategy or just in general, enabling leaders is going to be so important. So my main point in all this third pillar is this: how do we turn the search of what you saw on the left to the search that we want to see on the right, right? My manager appreciates me. They recognize me. They care. They invest, develop new skills. My manager is awesome. That's what I want to see, not the stuff that we saw on the left-hand side. So those are 3 of the major pillars and trends, right? The fourth, and I think really critical when it comes to leveraging surveys and this strategy to improve employee experience, is leveraging data in new ways, right? If you're more agile and you're getting more continuous feedback, right, across the whole employee lifecycle, and you're leveraging technology, you start collecting a lot more data, right? And the way you use that data is so critical in this last pillar. When I've seen organizations basically unlock this concept, say we're sitting on a bunch of data above and beyond just surveys, how we correlate that information can become very, very exciting, right? And we've seen a lot of companies do amazing things with that data. But unfortunately, so many companies are still here, right? This is their survey data, or this is their employee voice data, or this is what their action plans look like really hard to manage. And what I love about this is when we can't make sense of this data, we give it to our Excel wizard, usually in another department. We say, help us make sense of this and build a dashboard in Excel, or throw it into the BI system. And that takes another month and a half, right? Like there's challenges with that process. Maybe I'm bitter because from much of my career, I was this guy, I was the Excel guy. All the stuff came to me and I was trying to figure out how to make it usable, but not like today where you can automatically send it into systems and automatically update, like it was very manual. But this is the real future. It's quicker, there's less human error, right? When you have real dashboards, it's more confidential than looking at raw survey data. But I bring this up in terms of data and insights because I want to share a few examples of what I mean by this. First one I want to share is something we are all very familiar with, right? This is usually what your survey data looks like. Some things are good, some things are not so good. Now, I'm not sure the journey of everyone here, right? Maybe you're just getting started in your employee survey and data analytics. Maybe you're super sophisticated, but bear with me. I think it's still relevant as a reminder. And again, like I've seen companies, big, small, medium, that literally still start here in the story. But what I mean is that what they're still doing when I meet them is they get their data from an engagement survey like this, and they say, all right, let's fix those. Let's focus on the bottom score. Then what do I mean by fix and focus? Right? They create action plans corporately in the company around them. They change their quarterly objectives. They tell leaders to focus just on these two things. But the reality is that they're missing out leveraging data analytics in a more insightful way. And technologies and AI is making this a lot easier. But what I mean is that sometimes the things that actually drive better employee experiences are not the things at the bottom. And again, some people are down this journey, some are not, but there's simple correlative analyses that can be happening, regression modeling that can identify where should you spend your time and effort to see the biggest impact, right? And as I've been saying a couple of times, you can't solve all the world's problems, but it's our jobs as HR organizations. How do you get the right data and analysis to understand what has the biggest impact? Or how can we be predictive as possible of where to spend the most effort versus let's just use the bottom two? So that's one thing. I think it's simple, low hanging fruit. There's easy technologies to leverage today to be able to try to get this insight. But another way of using insights, not data, is something I like to call avoid insights in isolation. You might be wondering why Beethoven, a bit of a sidebar, but he discussed the concept of isolation in the early 1800s, like a long time ago, because he was deaf. And that really challenged him personally. And it's just a great read if you have a chance around the concepts of isolation. But that's why Beethoven is there and another music reference. But the thing companies are prioritizing today is how do you ensure that your data is not in a vacuum, right? It doesn't sit in the survey. It's correlated with other insights. It's leveraged in different ways. Here's a really good example, right? I have organizations that will conduct, an engagement survey, and maybe one of their active listening strategies, mid-year is infusing in diversity, equity, and inclusion surveys, right? They really want to build a more inclusive and, workplace where people feel like they belong. So most companies will conduct their DEI survey and they'll look at things like what is the DEI index for underrepresented groups, by sexual orientation as an example here. But what they are sitting on this gold mine is not just looking at this data, but taking your engagement survey data or your measurement, in this example, ENPS, and saying, oh, actually, these groups have an engagement score and ENPS much lower than others. Right? I find that when executives or leaders look at DEI indices, this type of data, it's hard for them to really understand the impact of it, or the impact of it. When you take it to brass tacks about are those groups more engaged or less engaged in your organization, it kind of changes the way you look at this information, right? So not leaving your data in isolation. This is just as simple as layering on two different surveys or two different data points, right? It's an easy way to get there. Actually, when I run the DEI surveys for WorkTango, it's our DEI survey, and all I'm asking is the engagement measurement questions back to active listening so I can trend that a lot easier, but I also can use it in a more real-time way, right, without having to replicate a whole engagement survey or whole DEI survey separately. Or another example that I see all the time is I was mentioning earlier, WorkTango not only is an employee survey platform, but we provide one of the most robust recognition and reward technologies out there. But imagine not just looking at engagement by generation and department and location, right? Or the last slide, like by DEI indices, but by whether people are getting recognized or not, right? Now we can have some level of correlation between do people that get recognized in the platform, are they more engaged or is their sentiment higher? And you can get so much more sophisticated with different types of analyses. But the point is you're sitting on a gold mine of data, right? How do you use it? How do you leverage it? Now, the last thing I want to share with you is something that I'd say is relevant above and beyond surveys, but is really, I think it matches our conversation today. And it's one of the biggest pieces of advice about using data and insights that I received in my career. So I want to share it with all with you, and hopefully you can take this back as well. I always get feedback. This is one of the most memorable parts of the talks that I do. But the story goes about oh my gosh, 17, 16 years ago, I had a leader that said, Rob, don't come to the table if you don't have the art of data. And just like you, I was like, what the hell is the art of data? Right? I like that made no sense to me. And he repeated himself. He's like, if you don't have the art of data, you'll never have a seat at the table. And I was still confused. But I figured it out. I finally got it out of him. But the art of data is an acronym. A is for absolute, R is for relative, and T is for trend. And the idea, and I'll use survey data to give you the exact same example, but the idea is that if you look at your engagement index or your learning and development score, whatever you're measuring, and you have a score like 77.2% or 86%, that's just an absolute number. Absolute is in isolation. There's no context, there's no evidence to act, there's no understanding of what that really means. So think about that, right? When you think about relative, right? Is that actual data, let's say compared to the organization, is it high? Is it low? Right? Compared to other industries or other companies in your industry, is it positive or is it negative or above or beyond that? That relative data point and comparison adds a whole other layer of understanding, right? It's building the picture, right? The art is being drawn in terms of what the data even means. The next part is on the trend side. Like if it was 77.2 and your last survey it was 90, well, that's not good. But if it was 40 and moved up to 70, that's amazing. So you lose the idea and the art of what the real story is telling unless you have absolute, relative, and trend. Like I said, very relevant to surveys, but I think relevant just in any profession. I don't care if it's HR or not, but ways to really drive success when it comes to data, right? So remember, if you don't have the art of data, don't bother coming to the table or the conversation. So that was the last thing to recap. 4 modern employee survey trends for improving employee experience. One, a continuous listening strategy, right? How do you not only get frequent, right? The magic isn't just doing more frequent pulses, it's combining that frequency with measurement and diagnostic feedback. What's working, what isn't, right? It takes a little more effort, but you can have really short, concise surveys to be able to understand and use the data to actually act better or understand the impact of your HR programs or actions, right? So, number one is a continuous listening strategy. Two, amplify voice in action with new technology, right? It's out there. Start thinking about it and leveraging it and just amplify it with technology in general for your HR practices. Think about your HR, HR tech strategy going into 2026 and beyond. But again, right, it's hard to really move the needle unless you're leveraging technology that not only exists today, but new ones that are coming out seemingly every month in terms of new ways and abilities to do things. Third thing, the leaders have to be at the center of your journey, right? I talked about it. I was pretty blunt about it. But at the end of the day, your leaders are the cog, or the part of the cog in the system that makes it work or not. You remove leaders from your strategic, idea and thought of employee experience and what employees do every day. If you remove leaders from that whole system, right, or you don't involve them or grease them and provide that cog everything it needs to operate, the whole system falls apart, right? We talked a lot about how you can share data with them, right? Build accountability at the end of the day. And lastly, it's around leveraging data in new ways, right? Your data that sits in your survey should never just be that, right? There's other ways to layer them on, correlate it, leverage more sophisticated data analysis to really get you to that next level. Now, what I mentioned last time when I was starting off the talk was I wanted to leave the conversation today with a few mindsets. And I mentioned that, again, I had the pleasure. I've worked with hundreds of organizations over the last 20 years, and I get to ask, hey, in retrospect, when you started this journey and you were changing your strategy, whether that's been surveys or recognition or so on, in this case, I'm talking about their survey and listening strategy, I asked them to reflect back and say, what was the right mindset that you had to move the needle forward, right? When you look back, what do you recommend or suggest other people? So I've collected all these conversations over the years, and I have 4 for you in terms of what I consolidated down to in terms of some of those mindsets, which I think will be helpful in people's journeys. So here they are. First is using consumer principles. So what I mean by that is what is your organization doing when it comes to interacting, understanding sentiment of your consumers, right? And also just at the end of the day, they were humans before they were employees, right? So they were humans that were consuming things and consumers way before they started working at your organization. So thinking about it from that lens is really critical. And a lot of folks talked about how working in concert with that same customer lens was really important. And I've been showing this one slide for a long time, but it's gold. And what it shows is that if you really want great business performance, think about your customer relationship systems, engagement, personalizing, things for your customers, listening to your customers, sentiment analysis, loyalty programs so they keep coming back, service and support your customers so they never leave you. But these same concepts should be about your talent. How do you think about the employee engagement? How do you personalize messaging to them? We all know when we get non-personalized messaging, it's the worst, right? Talent sourcing, listening signals, sentiment, right? How do you understand sentiment? Reward and recognize them, service and support employees so they never leave. A lot of people ask me, like, well, can you build in context of just employee surveys? And, Net Promoter Score is a great way to do that. Net Promoter Score was created a while ago about getting customer feedback. Would you recommend this product to a friend? Now we use that in this space, right? Would you recommend this as a great place to work? And I will tell you, a decade of looking at data sets, the engagement index is many times very well correlated to this one question. Would you recommend this as a great place to work? So when you think about those quick active listening pulses, you can easily understand with one question how your trends are going when it comes to overall employee sentiment, when it comes to measuring things like engagement. So that's number one. Second mindset that I kind of curated from the list was around your process must be inclusive. And the best way I like to share that is this concept of all. So accessibility, right? Is it available for people to give you feedback? Are you being inclusive that everyone can give you feedback, whether they're sitting in front of technology or not in front of technology or so on? So how do you make sure it's accessible? And second is language, and not just language across the globe, but maybe reading level. Work with a lot of organizations where they are using different reading levels to make sure the understanding of the sentence, the questions and what they're asking, everyone can have a similar wavelength to make sure the insights are consistent. And lastly, around limitations. It is so often I've seen organizations like healthcare or even government in some divisions where people don't work full 40-hour weeks, 52 weeks a year. They take 3 weeks off or a month off here and there in terms of different shift work. And the surveys within that time period, and people don't even have the opportunity to provide voice. So sometimes the limitations in terms of just how people work. And if you can kind of take this into account and be inclusive of what everyone's saying and thinking, it's a really critical part of the employee listening process. Third thing I want to mention in terms of major mindset is that HR needs data to make decisions. So many times I heard in my conversations, like I keep getting told HR needs to bring data to the table, right? Bring more information, bring real-time insights to be able to understand and make decisions on. But then when we ask to actually move to an active listening and do a survey more than once a year, we get pushback. But if we don't have that data, right? If we're only listening to employee sentiment confidentially once a year, that one moment in time isn't going to cut it, right? We don't listen to our customers once a year, right? Similar to that theme. And what I found really interesting is that if we had that idea that you need more data to make decisions, it helps you build that employee experience in a different way. And what's funny is I don't know if many people remember these Google rework studies, really popularized in public over a decade ago. They put some new stuff out. It was cool. But their two biggest reports that everyone was losing their mind over was Project Oxygen and Project Aristotle. Two major components of those were employee surveys, right? Feedback. The foundation was hearing the voice and understanding employee sentiment through surveys and some other data points they correlated it to. So that was the third mindset. Fourth mindset, if you're thinking about your organization, don't think about your employee experience strategy, signing up to your HR strategy, then moving up to the business strategy. It's one business strategy and one people strategy that is not owned by HR. It is owned by every single leader in your organization, right? As you build and present your 2026 HR strategy and plan, your holistic one, or even your employee survey and listening one, show this slide and get buy-in that this is exactly what it's all about. The right side, not the left-hand side, right? I think if getting buy-in on this is so critical, not only for your executive team, but all your key leaders in your company as well. Now, I said there was 4 mindsets. I have one bonus one, and it's this one. Everyone thinks this means, research and development, but it means rip off and duplicate. Honestly, find what other companies have done out there. Ask me, I'll send you any story out there of a company in your industry and how they changed their strategy, or have a chat with them and just steal what they did, right? Steal it and use it in a little bit different way that talks to your culture. But you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Thousands of companies have done this before and found success. I'm sharing four of the key themes of all the trends and themes I've seen move the needle, but you don't have to reinvent it, right? Just rip it off and duplicate it from someone else. So that being said, I want to thank everyone for your time and your attention today. Again, I never made it as a musician, but this is the closest I get to it, right? I actually pretend like I'm on stage and everyone's cheering and I got my guitar. But I'll take the HR.com event as a close second. So thank you, everyone. If there's questions, I know there's not a lot of time. Reach out to me on LinkedIn. I love connecting with folks. Happily take your call. But yeah, hopefully you have a great rest of the day and hopefully you enjoyed the event. Take care, everyone.